Chapter 291, Mythical Ring, 2. Helena turned incorporeal to escape from the intense heat while Flitwick started to sweat heavily but refused to tear his eyes away from the spectacle before him. Nick raised his hammer and for the briefest moment both Flitwick and Helena had the illusion that the sun itself had manifested on the head of it before Nick struck the ever-changing ring. In an instant the scorching heat vanished as Nick sent most of his energy into the ring yet again. Flitwick took the next shift in keeping the enchantment unstable while Nick soundlessly sat down to meditate again. After 2.5 hours he recovered his energy and stood up to move on to the next part of the enchantment. This time when he started to channel his energy both Helena and Flitwick braced themselves for whatever insane phenomena he manifested next. Nen to an ear Ros Helka, water river ocean rain ice, he spoke firmly and the energy around him turned azure while heavy and flowing like the various forms of water he was channeling. This time the room grew horribly humid and sticky as the concentration of water in the air shot up. Once again the phenomena vanished when Nick brought down his hammer. Nick's body started to ache horribly as the strain of this intense forging started to take its toll on it. From an outside perspective it seemed as though he had only swung his hammer 3 times so far, but in each of those swings he imbued the vast majority of his energy before resting the bare minimum amount of time needed to recover. Such an action puts an incredible strain on his body, leaving him sore at the moment, but he wasn't not even halfway done yet. Sitting down, Nick sips a bit of Wiggenweld potion to ease the strain on his body before meditating. While this was going on, a single person outside the workshop knew that an incredible amount of energy was being thrown into this forging session. Dumbledore was quite connected to the wards of the school as the headmaster, and as such the fluctuations of power from the workshop were transmitted from this connection. He was not surprised about this, however, as Nick and Flitwick had already warned him that they would be unavailable for the next 3 days due to an intense crafting session. I wonder what sort of amazing thing will come out of that room this time, he thought with a small amount of excitement. Nick's meditation was taking longer and longer the more he used it to restore his energy, as this time it took 4 hours for him to recover fully. This is the last part for today, since I will need true rest after this, he said seriously, and both of his helpers nodded in understanding. Channeling his energy once again, Nick closed his eyes and fully calmed himself before he started to speak. Ambul Litsa Oranti Nor. Stone. Sand Mountain Land, he said firmly, and the energy immediately turned hard and brown while the phenomena this time was far more oppressive than the previous 2. For both Helena and Flitwick it was as if they had been buried alive as the air pressed on them from all directions. It vanished just as soon as it came, however, as they watched and fell into the illusion of a grand mountain being held in Nick's hand as he brought the hammer down. Like that they were done for the day, with the exception of Helena, who as the only one not needing sleep was in charge of keeping the enchantment unstable. Nick wasted no time at all conjuring a bed for himself in the workshop and falling onto it. Sleep overtook him immediately as his exhaustion, both physical, spiritual, and mental, was paid its due. He awoke 9 hours later refreshed in all regards and ready to continue the forging process. Much like himself, Flitwick had also conjured a bed in the workshop to rest in, but had long been awake since his goblin blood meant he only needed about 4 hours of sleep to properly function. Helena was herself resting in a way as she had taken her incorporeal form, as hours of constant magic use had left her a bit drained. Nick got up out of the bed and didn't even bother removing it, since he would simply use it again in a few hours. I should be able to finish the foundational work today, and then it is time for the really hard part, he said seriously, and both of his helper nodded in understanding. He channeled his energy as he walked over to the anvil, and soon he began to speak as he gripped his hammer rest upon it. Guilo Shurhwesta Hero. Air. Wind breath storm, he said firmly, and the energy seemed to become formless and invisible, yet an intense gale swept through the room pushing against Helena and Flitwick. Chapter 292, Mythical Ring, Final. Once again the illusion of the greatest embodiment of wind came to them in the form of a mighty hurricane held in Nick's hand. Unlike previously, there was a change in the large constantly shifting ring when he imbued this part of the enchantment into it. The ring began to violently change shape into each of the elements in a manner that made both Helena and Flitwick nervous. Nick was calm, however, as he had expected this might happen once all 4 elements were fully added to the ring. At the moment they were clashing as they worked out a sort of balance between them as they would in nature. It didn't take long for the clash to end as the elements settled into an uneasy balance. At that point Flitwick took over in keeping the enchantment unstable while Nick meditated. Use Arta in the next part of the enchantment, the result may surprise you. Celebrimbor spoke up from the mindscape in a mysterious manner before going quiet again. Nick fell deep into thought at what was said, however, as he hadn't even thought of using that word due to its meaning. Arta was a word that held great weight in the language as it meant realm or bounded region. This referred to all of known creation that was made by the Einar, that were basically angels created by Eru Elevator, basically God. It wasn't hard to imagine the sort of thing that would come about as a result of adding this word to the enchantment. While it was true that Nick intended to create a small pocket dimension within the ring which he was slowly setting up, he had never thought to try and create a realm of all things. Such a thing steps dangerously close to the act of an angel or demon in terms of significance. The worst part was that he was sorely tempted to do it just to see if he could in fact pull it off. He knew that it would obviously be a very small realm even if he succeeded, but a realm was a realm regardless. Once his meditation was over, a couple hours later he stood again and took a deep breath before calling upon his energy once more. Talam Elan Lustaminal Arda. Space. Star Void Heaven Realm, he spoke, and the world shuddered as space itself seemed to harden and condense around Nick. Veins popped out as Nick strained against the pressure of this understanding and power, and the hammer slowly fell before gently tapping the ring, but that was enough. The power flowed into the unfinished ring and it violently expanded and contracted as it grew terribly unstable. Quickly. Bind it to your soul. Celebrimbor urged with clear panic in his voice. Nick grit his teeth and bit his thumb to draw blood that he then infused with all but the tiniest spark of his spiritual essence. The brightly glowing drop of blood flew out and sank into the ring. Nick's vision faded as the lack of energy forced his mind to shut down, and he had the strangest dream. He found himself floating in the blackest void with no body and no stars or anything else for that matter. Then he felt a change as a strange voice he didn't know started singing in a strange way that had no words but contained great meaning. From this song came the stars, the sun and moon, and a small spherical object made of stone. As the song continued, more and more stones appeared and violently crashed into the first, making the shape bigger and bigger. Then the song shifted tone and water appeared and rained down upon the uneven sphere of stone, creating lakes and rivers with some great and others small. The song changed yet again, and suddenly the void was no longer empty but filled with some invisible something. Air was created. This air gathered around the sphere and was held in place by some fundamental force, and Nick watched as the sun heated the water that then rose into the air and formed the first cloud that then wept upon the sphere in rain. Nick watched as the song changed again, but yet nothing changed in the sphere at first, but then the land and waters began to shift and liquid stone rose up, spewed violently across the sphere as the sphere shifted and began to rotate around the sun and the moon around the sphere. It was only then that the song ended and Nick realized that all along the voice that was singing was his own. He then opened his eyes. Chapter 293, Arda Milmi. Nick saw that he was once again in the workshop and that Flitwick was looking over him worriedly. Ugh, how long was I out? He asked as he sat up. He had a headache but wasn't all that surprised about it, considering he was fairly certain he had just witnessed the birth of a world. About 6 hours or so. The small professor said, and relaxed as he noticed that Nick was fine. Nick was better than fine, in fact, as he was not only fully restored in terms of energy but also felt a strange pressure on his mind. Examining this pressure, he quickly found himself once again standing in the void, but unlike in his previous dream, the elements were in chaos and clashed violently against each other. Nick pulled back his examination of the pressure and stumbled for a moment in disorientation. No need to worry, that was my doing. He reassured Flitwick with a smile. Helena had apparently been keeping the enchantment on the ring unstable this whole time and was clearly struggling with it. Nick picked his hammer up from the ground next to the anvil and didn't glow even though he channeled his energy. He then fell into a trance as he started to sing a primal and wordless song that sent shivers down Flitwick and Helena's spines. As he sang, his hammer rose and fell on the unfinished ring, sending an invisible magical shockwave from his body that every wizard in the world past the third threshold of power felt. They didn't know what it was, but the rhythm seemed to strike at their very souls and brought tears to their eyes, though they knew not why. Grindelwald wept freely with a wide smile and an unmistakable expression of joy. So you have finally taken that step, it seems. I can't wait to see the world you build for myself. He spoke cryptically, much to the confusion of his subordinates nearby. Dumbledore also wept, but had a confused but calm expression. He knew what was causing this phenomenon but didn't know how the person responsible was doing it. The Flammels also shed tears, but both had joyous expressions, as for the briefest moment that the rhythm lasted they had felt the birth of a mythical craftsman. Still, as the song of creation circled the globe, it sent quite a few wizards into a panic, since they did not know what they were experiencing and the fear of the unknown crept up on them. The only powerful wizard who did not feel this rhythm was Voldemort in the forests of Albania. His incomplete soul and lack of a magical core, since he had no body, meant that the rhythm passed through him unseen and unfelt. The biggest phenomena, however, was that for this brief instant every single magical beast on the planet was silent. They dared not make any noise as the song of creation resonated with each and every one of them. Soon Nick sang the final note of his song and struck the ring on the anvil one final time before he fell out of his trance. He didn't know why, but he instinctively knew that he needed to place greed on this new ring, which he did without hesitation. Greed sank into the large shifting ring alongside all of its contents, and the ring glowed a bright rainbow light before solidifying into a strange glowing glass-like form. Nick spoke one last time to complete this forging session, and the ring Arda Milmi, Realm of Avarice. Ring, Arda Milmi. Grade, Mythical. Abilities, Auto-Sizing, Formless, Devouring Counterattack, Fear Transformation, Storage, 3 cubic meters, Bound, Nicholas Ravenclaw, False World, Growth. Mythical ability, Realm, a small pocket dimension capable of supporting life that can grow infinitely so long as it is fed enough materials. Description, a monstrous creation that was created to be a hellish defender of its owner's belongings stored within. Much like a boggart, the ring doesn't have a set form and is deceptively plain until provoked. This ring contains a false realm dimension bound to its creator that can grow infinitely. System appraisal, a complex and powerful creation that deserves a place within myth created by an established ring smith. Nick's eyes bugged out when reading the system appraisal of the ring sitting on his anvil, as it was far more powerful than he had even thought. He also had a sneaking suspicion that the only reason the ring wasn't legendary grade was because it lacked a second transcendent ability and that its current realm was only 3 meters large. Is it done? Flitwick asked while looking at the strange glass-like ring on the anvil. Nick nodded and handed the half-goblin the ring, which shrank down to normal size the moment he touched it. Chapter 294, Realm Problems. The professor turned the ring over several times but frowned as he couldn't tell anything about the enchantment at all. It was almost like he was looking at a normal piece of scenery and not a complex enchanted item. With a helpless sigh, he could only give up on his examinations since he clearly wasn't going to learn anything about it this way. It's the oddest thing to know that something is a powerful artifact yet unable to tell. Out of curiosity, what was that song of yours anyways? I've never heard anything like it before. He asked curiously. Song? Nick asked, confused about what he was talking about since he fell into a trance during that period and thus didn't remember what happened. You sang a song while swinging your hammer, don't you remember? Helena asked with a look of confusion. Nick shook his head. The only thing I remember was stepping up to the anvil and then naming the ring to finish the forging. Are you saying I sang during that time? He sought verification and both of them nodded. He frowned at that before Celebrimbor filled him in on what exactly had happened. You sang the song of creation, the music of the Einar that birthed my world so very long ago. It is truly an honor to bear witness to such a thing. The elf said with the most reverent tone Nick had ever heard from him. I don't remember any of that, I'm afraid. Nick said honestly, causing both Flitwick and Helena to look disappointed. They truly wanted to know what exactly that song had been, but if Nick himself didn't know, there was nothing to be done about it. It is not a thing to be remembered but felt, as it is the harmony of concepts rather than something physical. Celebrimbor explained. Nick finally chose to turn in the mission he had gotten after the system updated, now that he felt he wasn't cheating the system. This resulted in 1 item ticket, 500 galleons and a crafting method ticket popping up in the new realm. It was weird, as Nick could feel the whole realm as well as everything in it as though it were a part of himself. No wonder they all got so angry when Morgoth corrupted the realm. It's like someone pissing on your hand, he thought seriously. Nick didn't hold back on any questions Helena or Flitwick asked him about his new ring that sat comfortably on the ring that previously held Greed. They were mostly just curious about what it did as well as what sort of benefits it had. To answer these, he directly brought them into the ring's realm. My goodness! A livable expanded space that feels just like standing outside, how wonderful! Flitwick squeaked in excitement as he waved his hand, creating a small breeze that rotated around the tiny planet. So long as I continuously feed it resources, it will also grow larger as well. Nick explained proudly. Is there a limit to how large this space can get? Helena asked curiously while picking up a book that was just sitting on the ground. When Greed had been integrated into this new ring, all of its contents had been haphazardly thrown about and Nick hadn't had the time to organize them again. No, in theory, if I feed the ring enough resources, I can expand this realm infinitely. Nick answered honestly. Incredible! This is truly a masterwork deserving of praise without any doubt. Flitwick said with a massive smile. I could not have done it without both of your help. Honestly speaking, this realm only has a single issue that makes it less than perfect. Nick said with a sigh. What might that be? Flitwick asked, confused, since as far as he was concerned this realm was perfect. It is bound to myself, so no one other than me can ever own it, even if I wanted to pass it to another. Nick said honestly. Flitwick was startled by this, but after thinking about it couldn't help but remember the drop of shining blood Nick had used to bring the ring under control during the enchanting process. Think nothing of it, my boy, this just means you now have something that everyone else can only be envious of. the professor said with a smile. Nick nodded. That's true, I suppose, but now I have the headache of trying to figure out how to grow this realm without sacrificing huge chunks of our planet to it. He said helplessly. As the owner of the realm, Nick was innately aware of what was needed to expand the realm. It was a simple process really, as he first needed to add space somehow, then fill the extra space with air, stone, and water to expand the tiny planet. Chapter 295, Visit. What do you mean? Flitwick asked curiously. The resources I need to expand the space available in this ring is space itself and the material that makes up our own world. Basically the only way to increase the size of this realm is to feed it parts of our own, which as you know is in rather limited quantities. Nick explained helplessly. Would conjured material work? Helena asked while casting a spell that summoned a boulder from thin air. When she released it, the boulder evaporated and yet no change occurred in the realm save a tiny uptick in mana concentration in the air. Never mind, she said awkwardly after seeing the lack of reaction the realm had to her conjuration. I'm sure you can grow this place plenty without worrying about the earth, just don't go sacrificing whole mountains and I'm sure no one will even notice. Flitwick said reassuringly. Nick nodded before bringing them out of the realm and back into the workshop. Unlocking the door to the workshop, Nick was surprised to find Dumbledore waiting outside it. Tempus. Nick checked the time but found that it was only 5:27 p.m. Good evening, Professor, is there something you need? Nick asked, a little confused why the man was here at all. Yes, actually, could you perhaps explain the phenomena that swept the globe earlier? Dumbledore asked with an amused expression while Nick went 6 shades paler in an instant. Did you say the globe? Nick asked for confirmation and the old wizard nodded while letting himself into the workshop. Oh yes, it caused quite the stir from what my sources tell me. The ministries around the globe think it's a precursor to something else, but I know differently. The headmaster said casually. Nick looked confused. A precursor to what? Grindelwald's insanity? He questioned out loud. I can assure you that Gellert is anything but insane, though I am curious as to why you seem aware of what he plans to do. Dumbledore said with a look of interest as he sat down in one of the chairs Nick had moved into the workshop for his friends. I may have read a tome or two on the topic of rituals in my free time, and the sacrifices didn't make much sense if that was how he restored his youth. Add on his binding oath and it's pretty clear he has something really big planned that is probably not a good thing. Nick said honestly. Dumbledore chuckled. Yes, that is a fairly good deduction of the situation. Thought I am certain I had all the tomes on rituals within the library moved the forbidden section. He said with an amused look. There are more sources of information than just the library at my fingertips, you know. Nick said, dodging that verbal pitfall easily. I suppose that is true, we've gotten a bit off topic however. The old goat said, not pressuring Nick at all on the topic of his forbidden knowledge. Nick shrugged. I don't remember that particular time frame unfortunately, but these two can probably explain it a little better than I could since they do. He explained while pointing at Flitwick and Helena. Dumbledore seemed surprised, but after listening to the other's account of the situation had an understanding look on his face. A magical epiphany, quite the rare event even for master crafters, but one valuable enough that many would be willing to sacrifice much to experience it themselves. I am a bit envious, to be honest, as I myself have only experienced such a thing 3 times in all my experiences. The old man said with a smile. Why have I never heard of something like that until now? Nick asked with a frown. In this case I'm afraid you are a victim of your own success. Should you have learned crafting in the traditional manner, you would likely be well aware of this information, as it is an open secret amongst crafters like us. By creating your own methods however, you lack the knowledge of the traditional crafters and as such weren't aware of such a thing until now. Dumbledore explained helpfully, and Nick grimaced since the old goat was probably right. His knowledge of crafting was based on the information within Celebrimbor's inheritance and as such only included what he deemed important to the craft. The fact the elf himself had also not mentioned this topic at least once meant he was probably unfamiliar with it as well. Perhaps it is a phenomena unique to this world's magical energy. Nick wondered to himself. With that answered, I find myself curious as to what you created during that event. Dumbledore said with a curious gaze at the glowing glass-like ring on Nick's hand. Chapter 296, Showing Off. Nick basically gave the old goat the same tour of the realm that Helena and Flitwick got, while also explaining how he could expand the size of it as well as its bound nature. In the end, Dumbledore surprisingly offered to support the expansion of the realm, since as an alchemist he could make spatial items fairly easily, and buying large amounts of stone is something people have been doing for centuries and is also fairly inexpensive for a wizard. Nick explained that while the spatial items would be appreciated, the stone he could get himself. The old goat was more than willing to accept that answer and even explained that he was only offering it to begin with because he was fascinated by the sheer potential the realm had. According to him, it was a rare and valuable opportunity that he had no intention of missing. After that, everyone went to dinner after getting into a deep conversation on crafting, since every one of them had a unique viewpoint on the topic to add. Helena had the stuff from the founder's time, Dumbledore his knowledge of transfiguration and alchemy, while Flitwick was a master enchanter himself. It was a fruitful conversation for everyone involved, with even masters like Flitwick and Dumbledore getting valuable insights that they had never even considered before. Nick though had the biggest takeaway, though, as he was the most inexperienced amongst all of them. When they all entered the Great Hall together chatting away, many gave them surprised looks. Nick sat at the Gryffindor table and was preparing to dig in when Hermione spoke up. "What have you even been doing this whole time? You never returned to the common room at all?" she questioned sternly. Nick flashed his new ring. "I was busy making this with Helena and Professor Flitwick," he said honestly. "Bloody hell! For 2 whole days?" Ron exclaimed, and Nick shook his head. "Obviously we took a few breaks, but for the most part it was near constant work for at least one of us," he said seriously. "Must be a mighty valuable piece of jewelry if that's the case." Seamus butted in while looking at the ring in question curiously. "Oh yeah, only one that I'll ever make because of what it does," Nick said honestly. "What's it do?" the twins asked at the same time, very interested. "The same thing as the ring it replaced, but like a billion times better. Not only does it let me store things in it, but I can also keep living things within it like plants or animals. I can also make the size of the storage infinitely larger so long as I feed the ring enough materials," Nick explained with a grin. Everyone listening to him was left dumbfounded. "Does that mean you could eventually have an entire planet all to yourself?" Dean Thomas asked with a doubtful expression. Nick nodded. "Yeah, if I give the ring a planet's worth of resources," he said honestly. "That's nuts!" Dean exclaimed in shock. "There's also no point in stealing it either, since it's bound to me exclusively. Even if I died it wouldn't work for anyone else. I won't ever make another one, so it'll be a priceless artifact forever," Nick said with a grin. A few people complained about how they really wanted a world to themselves too, but it was mostly joking. The ring continued being a topic of conversation for the rest of the night as Nick happily gave tours of his realm. He didn't do this for free though, but rather traded for whatever the others had to give. Money, knickknacks, potions, you name it, and he accepted it all, since after sacrificing it to the ring made his realm more and more perfect. Magical things, for example, broke down into mana and base elements that were fused into his mini planet of his realm. Interestingly, this extra mana didn't dissipate back into the real world but stayed in the realm and increased the concentration of mana in the air. He cheated a bit once he found that out and took a trip into the realm to purge out most of his mana into the air, which caused the concentration to rise greatly. Once he re-entered the real world, he passively refilled his stores using the ambient mana, which made him smile widely. He figured that if he sacrificed all of his leftover mana at the end of the day, his realm would likely become super saturated by the energy eventually, so long as he didn't expand the space too fast. Once he had the time though, he carefully reorganized all of his stuff in the realm as well, since it was a mess. Chapter 297, Concerning Development and Resolve. Dumbledore was not joking about his support in expanding the realm at all, as over the next few days he gave Nick no less than 30 miles worth of expanded space items that were fed to the ring, dramatically increasing the amount of room the planet had to fit in. The headmaster loved sitting inside the realm and casting spells that struck the edge of the realm before sacrificing a spatial item and then checking the distance improvement again. The old goat wasn't alone in this either, as despite Nick's insistence that he could afford to get the stone himself, Flitwick had purchased a large hill's worth of mixed soil just for this purpose. Helpless Nick could only indulge the 2 older wizards and watch the planet double in size. After the 3rd day though, things got busy for everyone as something came out of nowhere, ruining the peaceful school year. Harry woke up screaming at midnight on the night of November 15, having received a vision of someone in black robes and a skull mask sacrificing nearly 20 people to repair the decrepit body of Voldemort. Nick, Harry, and Ron immediately broke curfew to seek out Dumbledore. The old man had a grave expression after hearing the tale from Harry. "Are you certain about what it was you saw?" he questioned severely. Harry still had a horrified expression as he nodded, and despite noticing the old goat using legilimency on Harry, Nick said nothing because of the perspective of the vision Harry received. Voldemort had turned Nagini into a Horcrux 2 whole years early, and also had someone serving him when all his followers should be either locked up or ignoring him. Nick thought, concerned. This was a massive change from the events of canon and made Nick very worried. Voldemort's early return spelled serious trouble for the future, because not only was the madman aware that Nick had destroyed one of his Horcruxes, but he was also likely to start checking the rest of them as well. Considering Voldemort would definitely rehide the ring once he noticed that all but that one had been destroyed, Nick guessed he had at most 3 days to get rid of the thing as well as retrieve the resurrection stone. Harry, Ron, you go ahead and head back to the dorm, I need to talk to Professor Dumbledore alone first. Nick said seriously, and Harry looked at the headmaster, who nodded with a smile before both boys left. Nick knew that what he was about to say was going to open a huge can of worms, but he was pressed for time and Dumbledore was the only person who could help him. The moment he was sure that Harry was gone, Nick spilt the beans about Voldemort's Horcruxes, about how he had been hunting them down, about how Nazgul had turned into an actual creature by eating the soul shards, everything he knew about the Dark Lord. At first Dumbledore was in disbelief, then anger, and finally acceptance. I won't lecture you about how serious this matter is, since it's clear to me that you are well aware. Know however that I very much disapprove of you keeping this information to yourself and even the actions you have taken knowing it. Right now, however, as you have said, we have a more pressing concern in the form of the last inanimate Horcrux. You say you have tracked it down but have not had the time to collect and destroy it yet, correct? Dumbledore says sternly. Nick nodded. It's located inside the residence of the Gaunt clan, which is a shack in Little Hangleton, he said seriously. Don't try and go to that place without me, as not only do you lack the means to destroy the cursed thing while I have it, but the things have a way to ensnare the spirit which doesn't work on me. Nick added, shutting that thought down before Dumbledore could even have it. The old goat stared at Nick sternly. I cannot in good conscience allow you to continue to act against Voldemort in such a reckless manner, he said firmly. Nick snorted and immediately started pulling out the Horcruxes from his realm, the diadem, the locket, and the goblet. I am already inextricably involved in this matter and refuse to stop until that man is gone for good. Will you help me, or must I take drastic measures to get it done? Nick said, staring the man straight in the eyes. The two locked gazes for an entire minute without backing down, as the very air felt stifling as their magic pressured and clashed against the others. Eventually Dumbledore relented. So be it, but you must follow me orders without hesitation, understood? He said, and Nick nodded in agreement. Chapter 298, Enraged. Nick returned to the dorm room after that, while Dumbledore said he needed to prepare for the trip. Harry and Ron grilled Nick when he got back to the dorm about what he talked with Dumbledore about. Nick chose to trust them and told the truth about the matter, and they got mad at him for keeping it from them. It didn't have anything to do with either of you until now, so there was no reason why I should have told any of you. Nick defended himself. Besides, what good would it have done, hey? None of you could help at all and would have just been in danger instead. He added angrily. How could he not be mad when they didn't care about their own safety and even had the nerve to say he was wrong to keep it to himself? His words stung at his friends and they couldn't help but look hurt. They wanted nothing more to help him, but he flat out told them that they would be nothing but a burden instead. It stung and made them feel like bad friends as Nick stormed out of the dorm as well as the common room. Half of Gryffindor heard them and woke up from the commotion. Nick went straight to the room of requirement and vented his anger on some defenseless targets. Shattered and burnt wood littered the room within the hour as he violently attacked the dummies with his elemental abilities. Huff huff huff, again. He yelled while out of breath, but the room no longer reset itself. Nick was confused at this until Helena spoke up from behind him. You know, when Mother made this room, she added a special rule that we could always enter it regardless of what the person currently occupying it wanted. She said calmly. What do you want? Nick asked venomously as his anger got the best of him. Helena merely chuckled at that. I was angry and bitter for hundreds of years, having someone else get angry at me is nothing, she said, and Nick snorted and turned to leave since she had decided to play the part of therapist. He didn't need nor want it and refused to accept it, but the door of the room vanished entirely. He growled in frustration at that and raised his wand at the wall. Bombarda! He shouted, and a wave of concussive force flew from the tip of his wand into the blank wall. He wasn't angry in the same way as when Lockhart attacked him or when Dumbledore stole his blood to get his heritage revealed. This time it was more frustration than anything else, and thus he hadn't accidentally created bad weather or released his magical energy haphazardly. The thing about frustration is that it can be a tricky thing to get rid of permanently, like it can get buried for a long time before something triggers it and it erupts like a volcano. That was the state Nick was in at this moment, and so his mind wasn't very clear when he decided that since the wall stood in his way, it deserved to be destroyed. Nick had felt the pressure of Zeus and the recovery of the earth weighing down on him. Voldemort returning early was the last straw that broke the camel's back and caused him to snap. The force from the spell didn't destroy the wall though, as the room's wards sprang up and blocked the attack entirely. He was stumped by this enough to regain his sanity and clarity of mind. Feeling better? Helena teased, and Nick looked embarrassed since he must have looked like an angsty child to her. This wasn't to say that he was suddenly happy or anything, merely that he could at least rationally think about why he was upset now. Is it so wrong that I kept all this stuff from them? He asked, slightly lost. Helena shook her head. It's not wrong at all, but that doesn't mean it didn't hurt to get told that they were basically dead weight. In time I'm sure they will understand, but for now you all will need time to settle. She said honestly. Nick sighed. You're probably right, but man, if it isn't irritating. He complained. She let him leave the room after that, and Nick spent the night in the workshop with Nazgul, Dusk, and Steve all nearby, or literally on top of him in Steve's case. The next morning he ate breakfast in his workshop before Dumbledore arrived to head out and retrieve the ring from its hiding place. The man looked exhausted when he arrived outside the workshop, but considering the pressure he was under, it wasn't all that surprising. Chapter 299, Gaunt Shack. Need a moment to collect yourself? Nick asked with a raised eyebrow. This is a simple extraction and destruction mission, not a battle to the death, so I'll be fine. The old man said reassuringly. Nick looked like he didn't believe him, but chose not to mention it any longer as he sent Nazgul into his ring. Apparition is forbidden in Hogwarts, so are we going to Hogsmeade first, or is Fawkes taking us? Nick asked calmly. Dumbledore seemed surprised by the question but quickly recovered. It's best we go to Hogsmeade first. He answered, and Nick nodded. They left the castle after that and took a carriage to the small wizarding town near the castle. It was a quaint little place with various shops that were clearly only there to profit off the students of the school that regularly frequent the town. Each shop was less business and more personal, which made sense considering most of them were family-owned and operated. Other than the shops, there was the Shrieking Shack at the top of the hill on the far side of the town, as well as various homes dotted about the place in the strange haphazard manner wizards were fond of for some reason. Nick noticed the slightly conflicted look Dumbledore gave the seediest pub in the town, known as the Hog's Head Pub. Knowing that the place was run by the man's brother Aberforth Dumbledore, he chose to leave the matter alone. Nick may not like Dumbledore all that much, but that didn't mean he was going to purposefully dig at his old wounds for no reason. The death of his sister Ariana and thus the resulting falling out between the two brothers was an extremely sore subject to the old man, and Nick knew it. Take hold of my arm so that we may be off. Dumbledore spoke firmly, and Nick did as he was told, as he had agreed to. As always, apparition was a dreadful thing to experience that felt like getting sucked through a straw gut first. Nick felt the magic with his magical sense, but like before he couldn't make heads or tails of it as the spatial interference warped the feedback he received. The next moment they arrived in Little Hangleton, which was a sleepy place with an almost equal mix of wizards and muggles. Despite the large amount of wizards, the whole place was well covered in wards to prevent the muggles from paying too much attention to their unusual neighbors. Nick and Dumbledore arrived in an alley with a semi-loud pop. That apparition was well known for. Nick shuddered for a moment as he fought to settle his stomach from the nausea that he felt after the translocation. Dumbledore seemed amused about this but remained stoic as he led Nick eastward to the dark and run-down building hidden behind the trees. Nick couldn't help but notice the obscene amount of magical energy that tainted the place from the long-term occupation of a wizarding family there. The ambient mana was seemingly permanently stained with the residual traces of the Slytherin bloodline that drew many snakes to the area instinctively. The serpents avoid the two strangers on this land, however, as both felt dangerous. Soon the two of them arrived outside the building that still bore faint reminders of the long-lost glory of its previous occupants, yet was now merely a ruined and cursed place. That last part was meant very literally, as Voldemort had placed several dark enchantments in and around the building to protect his treasure. Step lightly, this place is full of dark magic and not just the one we are after. Nick said seriously, and Dumbledore nodded as all signs of fatigue vanished from him once the adrenaline started coursing through his veins. Both pulled out their wands before moving forward with determination in their eyes. Each of them covered the other as they disarmed each trap carefully and with precision. Together they made fast progress into the building and towards the living room that Nick felt the unmistakable magic of a Horcrux in. The defenses placed in this part of the shack were the firmest and slowed down the duo considerably, as they needed to be very careful in dismantling them. The traps were intricately linked to prevent one from tampering with them one piece at a time, which meant the whole thing needed to be done at the same time. Still they got through the cursed defenses and reached the place that hid the Horcrux. It's here, under the floorboards. Nick said seriously, and Dumbledore flicked the Elder Wand, sending the boards up and out of the way. There in the dust and dirt sat a small box tightly covered in curses and deadly traps. Chapter 300, Hallow's Plan. Dumbledore and Nick went to work disarming the various curses and traps on the box. It took them quite some time to finally go through the defenses and open the box to reveal the single strange-looking ring within it. It was a thin golden band with a stone set on top of it that definitely didn't fit it, as it was smooth, round-shaped and nearly 2.5 centimeters long. On the surface of the plain-looking grey stone was the symbol of the Deathly Hallows, a triangle within a circle that had a line going down the middle of it. Nick noticed Dumbledore's breathing change drastically when he saw this symbol, and a temptation to put the ring on came from the soul shard within the metal. Nick definitely noticed that the stone itself was entirely unconnected to the Horcrux, magically speaking. Before Dumbledore could reach out with his hand, Nick waved his wand through the spiritual coercion of the soul shard, snapping Dumbledore out of it. "You almost fell victim to the shard's influence, but lucky for you I can directly counter it," Nick said, and the old man had a horrified look. He himself was more than a little aware of just how close to falling for the temptation he had gotten, and as such knew that Nick wasn't exaggerating at all. "Let's quickly remove the curse from this ring so I can destroy the soul shard," Nick added, and Dumbledore nodded. Unlike the other defenses around the ring, the curse on the ring was well hidden and didn't have a counter curse to it. That was where Nick came in and removed it by hitting it with a few pulses of exactly opposite magical energy frequencies. Once the Horcrux was totally curse-free, Nazgul was pulled out to do her job. She immediately locked her gaze on the ring the moment she left the ring realm, as she had vague recollections of eating similar things. She immediately swiped out with her serpentine head and dragged the soul shard screaming out of the ring. Dumbledore felt goosebumps rise all over his body at this and watched stiffly as the no longer cute monster snapped up the soul shard with relish. "If you don't mind, I'll add this ring to my collection since it's totally safe now," Nick said while grabbing the Horcrux and tossing it into his realm without hesitation. Dumbledore only then snapped out of his head and realized that Nick had just taken the last of the 3 Hallows. He frowned as he realized that Nick definitely knew what the stone setting was, with how eager he was to store it away. "How did you learn of the Hallows?" he asked while backing away from Nick with his wand raised. "Oh, that? Quite some time now. My first run-in with them, however, was when you sent Harry his cloak last Christmas," Nick said casually. "Then you should know the fate that their owners all befell," Dumbledore said sternly. Nick laughed at that. "If you are referring to the terrible deaths their wielders experienced, then you have nothing to worry about on my regard. I don't intend to hold on to the stone for very long after all," he said with a smile. This left Dumbledore confused, since he couldn't understand why someone like Nick would give up such a thing. Nick saw his confusion and chose to explain himself, since the old man deserved at least that much in his opinion. "While the tales of Beedle the Bard says that the Hallows were made by death, we both know that this was not true exactly. In truth, the creators of the Hallows were the 3 brothers who instead probably learned from the entity in question instead. It goes to reason then that those same brothers likely placed an impossible to detect bloodline curse in the magic of each Hallow so that only a Peverell could use them safely. This explains why the descendants of the 3 brothers tended to live fairly long lives in the case of the descendants of Cadmus, the Gaunts, and Ignatius, the Potters. I have no use for the stone, but my good friend, who just so happens to be the last descendant of Ignatius and current owner of the cloak Hallow, might," Nick said, explained calmly. "Oh, and I suggest you find a way to pass that wand to him as well, since it's already plotting your death most likely," Nick added before walking past the stunned man, with Nazgul following along contented after a good meal. Chapter 301, Unofficial Holiday. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing either on Nick's part, as he had long been aware of the fact he would come into possession of the Resurrection Stone and thus had been planning what to do with it for quite some time. While the stone was quite the useful item in that it let you summon the spirits of the dead, there was a catch that made it nearly useless to Nick. See, the stone had a limitation in that it could only summon those who were personally known by the person using it. The reason this was useless to Nick was that he couldn't summon, say, the soul of Kronos or Merlin in order to learn from them. That limitation meant that besides torturing himself by summoning the soul of a friend or family member, the stone held no value. Besides that, Nick was a firm believer that the dead have no place in the land of the living, and the description of the torment the souls brought by the stone proved it. Even when angry, Nick was never one to purposefully torment others in any meaningful way. In the hands of someone ancient such as Nicholas Flamel, on the other hand, the stone was a source of old and forgotten knowledge, since the man could summon the souls of people from throughout his long life and copy down their knowledge. Still, Nick knew that the stone would only show its best in the hands of a member of the Peverell bloodline. Speaking of uses, Nick was currently analyzing the stone using his realm and was not surprised at what he was discovering. The stone itself was actually just a normal rock, like the sort one might pick up from the road. The person who made it into what it is currently, however, was a masterful enchanter, as each grain of the stones was positively covered in tiny complex runes that served as a part of the whole. Nick was fairly certain that if he studied the cloak as well in his realm, he would discover a similar thing. The Hallows weren't created by Hades, but it was clear that he had given the 3 brothers their inspiration and possibly even taught them via his projection. Why he would do something like this was beyond Nick's understanding, and would likely only be answered in the future when he met the god in person, assuming he survived that long, of course. It didn't take long for Dumbledore to find Nick after he left the old man to his thoughts and apparate them back to Hogsmeade without a word. Clearly the man was still caught up in his thoughts as he simply left Nick in the village before operating away again. Nick merely shrugged at this and chose to treat the day as an unofficial holiday for himself before letting out Nazgul from the Ring Realm. The two of them then made their way over to Honeyduke's candy shop to check for new or interesting treats. The owner of the sweet shop at the moment was Ambrosius Flume and his wife, who both didn't ask Nick a single question about why he was there during the week, since he spent close to 7 galleons on various sweets. He got some chocolate frogs, every flavor beans, lemon drops and even a blood-flavored lollipop that was apparently an experimental product of theirs. Nick helpfully tried the scarlet candy while in the store and admitted that minus the sweetness it held, it did indeed taste like blood. He even added that if they added a touch of cinnamon to the lollipop it might prove fairly popular. Mr. Flume was grateful for the input and wished Nick well as he left the shop, still sucking on the sucker for no reason other than he hated wasting food. He offered it to Nazgul, but she smelt the bloody smell of it and literally turned her nose up at it. Helpless, he could only eat it himself as he stopped by Scrivenshafts to collect some more ink and parchment for Hermione and Daphne, who went through the stuff very quickly with their rune practice. While he was there he also grabbed another engraving pen, since his was also starting to wear down from all the sharpenings it's gotten. After that he moved over to the 3 broomsticks and to indulge himself in a bit of butterbeer that was honestly closer to butterscotch soda than any proper alcohol. It was horribly sweet and had a very low alcohol content, meaning it was damn near impossible to actually get drunk off it. The owner of the inn, Madame Rosmerta, questioned Nick on why he was there during the week, but Nick explained how he was left here by Dumbledore, which plenty of people saw. Chapter 302, New Crafting Style. Still, after actually verifying that he had in fact been dropped off by Dumbledore, she was more than happy to take his business. Nazgul was also fawned over by the older witch, who simply couldn't get over how cute she was. This was nothing new for the spoiled creature, as she got similar attention from the females in the school as well. Colin Creevey had made a small fortune after taking a photo of her and then getting several dozen moving copies made that he sold at 6 nuts a pop. Once Nick felt he had done everything he wanted to in Hogsmeade, he pulled out his broom from his ring realm before flying rapidly and freely into the sky. He of course disillusioned himself, since he didn't want to deal with the questions about why he got out of a day's worth of classes without any of the teachers saying anything. Still, that didn't mean he didn't enjoy the short flight over to the castle before landing in the courtyard stealthily. Carefully creeping into the castle, Nick made his way over to the workshop, since he still needed to avoid people for the rest of the day until dinner in 4 hours. The room was empty, like it should have been after he made it clear that entering without permission was grounds for punishment previously. Sitting down in one of the chairs, he let Nazgul out of the ring realm and brought out his 2 reward tickets from it as well. First he spun the item roulette to see what he got and was pleasantly surprised to find out that he got the astral anvil. With this as well as the hammer, he could now complete each enchantment much more efficiently, since the anvil would reverberate the energy he channeled per strike back into the ring getting worked. He replaced his old anvil with the new one without hesitation before moving on to the crafting style ticket that made him a bit nervous. The first style he got was the mainstay of his entire enchantment process, and he had only barely mastered 80% of it to date, so if he got another that was just as complex he would greatly struggle to master both. The wheel that was summoned from the system after he chose to use the ticket was a bright rainbow color and shrouded in dense mist, much like it was previously. Soon the wheel began to spin rapidly before slowing down and landing on a glowing white option, and the congratulations notification from the system rang through his head. Congratulations on receiving the crafting style, Twilight. Nick read the name of the style but was confused, since he had no clue what it was about. Like when he got his first style, the roulette wheel burst apart and the fog in the room all gush up his nose and into his mind. Nick closed his eyes to sort through the information that he had just received and couldn't help but frown a little. Compared to the Celebrimbor style, this one was far simpler and also less versatile as well. The way this style worked was that the crafter collected light, not really light though, from the sun, moon, and stars before congealing it into a shape and function based on what the light was drawn from. Unlike the Celebrimbor style that was limited only by knowledge and personal energy stores, this style could only ever utilize the light of a finite amount of stuff. While there are a lot of stars to be used, it does still have a defined limit. Even more irritating was that Nick would have no idea what properties the light would have until after he spent the time to collect some of it. This wasn't a short process either, as it required him to attune his spirit to the specific light he was after, then force it from the air into solid form, which required serious effort. The easiest part of this style was the actual crafting, as all he needed to do was force the light he collected together with the given method and it did the rest on its own. There was an upside to this style of crafting, however, that was great: it allowed him to create objects far beyond his regular level of power. So long as he collected enough light he could theoretically congeal a legendary grade object on his first attempt. He wouldn't attempt it however, since unlike with the Celebrimbor style, this inheritance was lacking in a whole hell of a lot of details. Most likely the person who made it only wanted the inheritor to know the absolute basics, so they needed to experiment with it to learn the advanced stuff. Nick thought in irritation. Chapter 303, Collecting Light. Nick might be irritated at the creator's choice in this regard, but he also understood why they did it as well. See, crafting is an art, and much like painting or sculpting, each crafter went about the process in a different way depending on how they learned the craft. By giving only the barest minimum in basic information, the creator of this inheritance forced Nick to truly make the style his own, as he needed to do everything using his own methods. For example, it was probably possible to mix different lights together, but Nick needed to figure out how on his own, and whatever he came up with may be totally different than the method the inheritance's creator used. To put it bluntly, Nick had the foundation for this crafting style, but whatever he built on top of that would be his own work exclusively. Well, at least it shouldn't take me very long to master this new style, he thought with a shrug. That reminds me, for whatever reason, but does this mean you might be getting a new roommate in my head? Nick asked the old elf currently taking up residence in his mindscape. That depends on the creator of this new style of crafting. If they are willing, then their being will be pulled in by the system. Otherwise you will not be gaining another tutor at all. Judging from the inheritance, however, I very much doubt that this person will agree to guide you. Celebrimbor said seriously. Oh? Does that mean you agreed to teach me when I drew your own inheritance? Nick asked, interested in the answer. The old elf had a sad smile. After I died, my legacy was forever tainted by the foul hidden plot of Sauron, and I had hoped that by guiding someone with my inheritance I could redeem it somehow. You have so far proven my decision correct, he said honestly. Nick chuckled at that answer, since he was very aware that he was by no means perfect and had plenty of flaws. Compared to what Sauron used the style to accomplish, though, he was certainly redeeming it as a grand crafting style and not a evil thing. Hell, his most recent accomplishment was using the style to forge a miniature realm of all things, an untainted one no less. Nick dismissed his ego-inflating thoughts though and focused on a new plan. He wanted to create his first ring with this new style, and so needed to first collect light. The method to collect light was a sort of wandless silent magic involving hand signs. He first needed to extend his senses until he felt the light before slowly and very precisely weaving the correct hand signs to draw it into the material plane and harness it. This created the ore that he needed to forge his creations. With this in mind, Nick wasted no time at all leaving the workshop for the astronomy tower that was empty at this time of day. The basic information of the inheritance stated that the sun and moon were the easiest sources of light to harvest from due to their close proximity and ever-present nature. Thus Nick's first attempt at harvesting light will be with the most abundant source of it, the sun. No one even noticed Nick as he walked the halls, since students moving about at this time was totally normal and not worth mentioning. The astronomy tower was in fact empty, just like he had expected, so he reached the exposed top of it easily. Once there, he felt the heat of the sun touching his face and closed his eyes to extend his senses in the way that his new style dictated. It was a strange feeling, as it felt almost like the world around him faded away like a blurry image, while a certain something started to stand out in the image that was always there but not at the forefront. Nick focused on this thing and slowly and awkwardly began to move his hands in the way that the style dictated to drag the light into the material plane. He felt his magic flow into his hands on its own as he performed these hand signs and extend from his fingertips like strange threads that felt odd to him, but he couldn't say exactly why. The threads crept through the air and wrapped around the light loosely before retracting as he cycled through the different hand signs. He was rapidly losing mana as they did so, since the light seemed very resistant to his actions, and in the end he only managed to retrieve a pebble's worth of the stuff before exhausting the majority of his mana. Chapter 304, Strange Material. Nick opened his eyes after he felt the light touch his palm and examined its appearance closely. It was an orange-red color with a strangely heavy feel to it, like it was made of tungsten. Despite that, however, Nick could easily deform the material with the strength of his fingers alone, showing how soft it was. After he was done examining the material, he placed it within the ring realm to try and analyze it on a much deeper level, and was surprised by what he found. He could feel a certain desire from the realm for the stuff, as if it was a piece of it that it had been missing until now. It wasn't hard to figure out why either, as the ring realm didn't have a sun or any stars but was in a state of perpetual twilight as the light within it bounced around without settling. The material taken from the sun's light, however, was basically condensed essence of the sun, which the realm wanted to complete and perfect itself further. The problem came in the form of a mountage, however, as Nick could also tell that he required a lot of the material to satisfy his realm even at its current size, much less later. Despite instinctively wanting to perfect his realm, Nick chose to ignore that craving, since it was a waste of time to focus on doing so at the moment. Instead he focused on understanding everything he could about this new material to see what all the possible applications of it may be. The stuff has a very high mana conductivity but also an equally high mana dispersion rate, which makes it a poor choice for long-term enchantment but excellent for short-term magical applications such as rituals or alchemy, he thought seriously. It seems to inherently possess anti-curse as well as purification power that would also make it ideal for a defensive item, though I would need to discover a method of hardening it for such a thing, he theorized as he got more and more information from his realm. While the style said that it was impossible to tell what abilities the light would have until it was utilized, it was obvious to Nick that the creator of the inheritance had not thought about someone with a personal realm gaining the inheritance. To be fair though, a personal realm was an extremely rare thing to have for someone as weak as he was, so that is to be expected. At least I won't have to waste much time on lights that I don't want and can simply feed those to the realm instead, he thought as he left the astronomy tower. Pulling out his wand he spoke Tempus. And the current time entered his mind, 5:45. I should start heading towards the Great Hall for dinner, he thought with a nod. It only took him about 5 minutes to arrive at his destination and seat himself at the table. He was slightly early, so there weren't many people in the Great Hall at the moment, so he played around a bit with Nazgul and Steve as he waited for dinner to start. It was a simple game really, as they needed to each chase down a small marble of light he summoned and controlled. In Steve's case the marble rolled on the floor, while for Nazgul it zipped about in the air. Most of the students watched the two magical beasts playing happily in interest, since it was a rare sight. The professors started to arrive early and noticed the activity, and most smiled warmly at the cheerful mood it provided, while others such as Snape chose to ignore it. None of the teachers whose class Nick missed today said anything to him about it, since Dumbledore had already given them a vague excuse for it, which was enough. The only one that was truly aware of where Nick had been was Snape, due to him being the triple agent working for Dumbledore and Voldemort. It was a complex sort of relationship, as he fed information to Voldemort while also doing the same to Dumbledore, but he was actually working for Dumbledore. Still, once the students started to arrive en masse, Nick dispelled the marbles and brought the two creatures back under control. Poor Steve though was so out of shape that he was panting and looked dreadful from the workout. He did it to himself with all that food and no exercise, Nick thought, while administering a small amount of workout potion to help the chunky niffler recover a bit. As an added bonus, Steve also lost a tiny amount of fat as well, so that was a plus if nothing else. Chapter 305, Rage. Voldemort POV. Things had not been going my way ever since that night so long ago when I tried to subvert that damned prophecy by killing its candidate. The parents were easy to dispatch since my arrival had caught them off guard. The father had lacked his wand entirely but resorted to physical means to try and fend me off, an admirable display of courage but ultimately futile. And the mother, a curse upon her soul, shielded her child, her own body, and every ounce of her magic responded. I was so caught up in my inevitable victory that I didn't even notice the ancient magic activating. I cast the killing curse on the child and fell into the trap. Pain racked my very soul and my body shriveled and decayed as my immortality fought against the magical death that would have been apportioned me without it. I barely managed to hide away my wand in the room before my body was destroyed and I was reduced to a pitiful and pathetic wraith-like state. I fled to the forests of Albania for nearly 10 whole years, building my strength from the vermin and wretched creatures there until Quirrell found me. He willingly allowed me to reside within his body in exchange for knowledge on how to grow more powerful. An acceptable price to pay in order to steal the Philosopher's Stone and recreate a body truly suitable for me to reside in. You might be able to imagine my anger to learn that the child prophesied to strike me down was barely above average in academics. Me, an archmage laid low by an average individual. The boy's friend, however, was very much a different story, as he was so talented that I was slightly envious. Creating his own enchantment method before even getting into the school, mastering spells with little effort, and an innate talent in transfiguration on the same level as a metamorphagus. Sadly, I never got the option to dispose of or persuade the boy, as he avoided me surprisingly easily. That was before that old fool revealed the boy's heritage to the world, and I knew without any doubt that the child needed to be dealt with the moment I got a new body. The last no descendant of Rowena Ravenclaw, and by extension the lord of the house. As a descendant of Slytherin myself, I of all people knew the power that such a bloodline granted. In the hands of a talented and clearly ambitious person like the boy, who was willing to work hard to excavate his full potential, reaching my level was almost a guarantee, and I simply couldn't allow that. Alas, things went horribly awry when the Potter boy confronted me while I was trying to figure out how to retrieve the stone from that blasted mirror. During that confrontation I felt the defenses I placed around the diadem get triggered and knew that I had been manipulated. The Ravenclaw brat had not gotten anywhere near the diadem whilst I was disguised as Quirrell, so I had assumed incorrectly that the Grey Lady hadn't informed him of the artifact housing a piece of my soul. In truth, the brat had lulled me into a false sense of security before making his move whilst I was busy dealing with the Potter boy, In my moment of distraction the potter child shattered the stone, ruining any chance of using its power for my own resurrection. When I went to strangle the child in my rage, I discovered that the boy's mother had placed protective magic on him that made it impossible for me to touch a hair on his head. Quirrell's body, which was on the brink of collapse, hit the final straw at that moment and finally fell apart, forcing me back into that wretched wraith-like state. I could only once again flee to the Albanian forests to bide my time while the Ravenclaw brat no doubt rapidly accumulated power. Fortune finally smiled upon me, however, when a strange individual arrived in the forests and swore themselves to me for vengeance against something that brat had done. It was less than ideal, but I agreed to the creation of a ritual to create a rudimentary body for myself until I could perform another to gain a perfect vessel for my massive magic. It was rather ironic how, while the failure of a Dark Lord Grindelwald was conducting sacrifices himself, for some reason I was using that to collect the sacrifices for my return. We held the ritual and I finally had a body of my own and immediately sought to learn all that had happened in my absence. It displeased me greatly to learn that Black had been released and Pettigrew executed. But it was only over the next few days that I felt rage burn inside me as I checked the hiding place of each of my Horcruxes only to find them gone, taken. Chapter 306, First Creation. Nick ate dinner without any issue at all and turned in for the night quite satisfied with what he had accomplished for the day. He was completely unaware that Voldemort was practically screaming for his blood at the moment after learning that his Horcruxes were missing. Voldemort was also horribly worried about his most recent Horcrux, however, as it was his last lifeline to immortality as far as he was aware. As a result, he layered an unreasonable amount of protections on Nagini to stop any attack on her. Unlike the other Horcruxes that could be hidden away safely, Nagini was a living thing and as such required food and water regularly to survive. As a result, he brought her everywhere with him now so that nothing untoward happened. If Nick knew about this, he wouldn't care to begin with, as compared to Voldemort his upcoming problems were far more important. As far as he was concerned, he had already removed all the irritating Horcruxes to deal with, leaving only the two simpler ones to deal with. Harry's soul shard was proving trickier than anticipated for Nick, as he had brought Harry into the realm to study it while he was showing off earlier and fully analyzed the connection between the shard and Harry. To put it bluntly, Harry's soul was firmly wrapped around the shard and needed one of two things to occur for it to be removed. The first was for Harry himself to gain control over his soul and fully devour the shard, removing its connection to Voldemort while also boosting his own talent and abilities. That was the best option in Nick's opinion and had only upsides with no downsides. The second method, however, was much worse. Harry needed to die. To be more specific, his soul needed to be fully removed from his body, allowing it to expand as bodiless souls do, releasing the shard that without a vessel would disperse. The problem with this method was that Nick would then need to expend the decade-long ability of the Staff of Asclepius to resurrect Harry after the soul shard was gone. The method Dumbledore used in the books also worked, but required so much coincidences to play out that it was better to not use it at all. Nick obviously wanted to take the first method, in a manner of speaking. See, he wasn't going to train Harry how to control his soul, but rather was going to give Harry the Resurrection Stone ring and secretly have Harry come into contact with the stone in his soul space and devour it. This way Harry didn't need to learn a dangerous thing like soul magic and could still get the benefits. Now I need to figure out how to do this without anyone figuring it out, he thought to himself as he slowly drew in more light from the sun the next day. It wasn't hard to improve at this new magic, since with only the bare minimum information it only took a few small adjustments to see improvement. It was a bit like learning how to swim by experience, as he flailed about at first, but when he found something that worked he immediately shifted to it and slowly got better and better at it. The biggest problem Nick had with this new light drawing magic was that it left him horribly vulnerable, as all of his senses were muffled as he focused on the lights. This meant if anyone were to sneak up on him or attack him, he may not realize it until it's too late. He was working on sensing the lights without dampening his other senses, but it was without any progress at the moment. He was very tempted to use his first enchantment method to create a ring to passively stat the light sensing magic onto his other senses, but he had this sneaking suspicion that may cause him serious problems later. Still, adjusting his light collecting magic was far easier, so he now had a basketball-sized mass of the sun's light material ready to use. Interestingly, unlike metal ore that remained separate from other pieces of the same stuff, the light instead fused with other pieces nearby. Nick stood in his realm holding the light material in his hands as he began the condensation process of the crafting style under the analysis of the realm. He made various hand signs that caused his magic to wrap around the material and begin to stab into and fuse with it. Once enough magic had been injected, the material violently shuddered and began to fold into itself while taking a specific form that it was most attuned to. To Nick's irritation, that form was not a ring of some sort like he had thought, but rather was an arrow with a round golden head and white flame-like feather fletching. Chapter 307, Soul Shot Arrows. It was about 2 feet long altogether but weighed practically nothing at all in his hands. Ugh! This is going to be one of those annoying things where I need to figure out how to shape the final product into a ring, isn't it? Nick thought with a groan. After carefully checking the analysis of the process, he was slightly relieved to notice that the final shape could be manually changed after it started. Nick checked the appraisal for the arrow that the system gave and was rather surprised at what he found. Arrow, Soul Shot. Grade, Rare. Abilities, Light Construct, Evil Purification, Sun Fire Burst. Description: an arrow crafted using a strange and unorthodox magic that condensed the sun's light into solid form. This arrow is the bane of all evil beings and can eradicate even the Amortal should it be evil. System appraisal: a circumstantial weapon that is either very powerful or very weak depending on what it is used on. This thing can kill Amortal creatures so long as they are evil. Did I just accidentally make a Dementor slaying weapon? No, not just Dementors but Lethofolds and maybe even other creatures as well. Nick thought with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he was happy that he could now work on getting rid of the foul things rather than contain them like the Ministry did. On the other hand though, this arrow painted a huge target on his back for every evil creature in existence. Ironically though, this arrow also made Voldemort stupidly easy to get rid of now, as the man definitely counted as an evil creature, and if this arrow can kill things that don't even have souls like Dementors, then Horcrux or not, he would also die after getting hit with it. Nice, now I don't even need to worry about Harry dealing with the soul shard. Instead I just need him to stab the noseless bastard with this thing to fulfill the prophecy. Nick thought with a smirk. Nick wasn't satisfied with only having a single one of these arrows, however, since there were hundreds of evil Amortal creatures that he wanted to get rid of, so he needed hundreds of arrows. This was how he spent all his free time for the next month when he wasn't in class or hanging out with his friends who were very unhappy about being left out of the dangerous stuff he has been doing. They got over it pretty easily when he distracted them by giving Harry the gaunt ring with the resurrection stone in it. He of course didn't tell them what the stone was, but he did say that it was an artifact belonging to Harry's bloodline which interested all of them. The only one who immediately figured out what it was Luna, but she kept quiet about it, likely because of how that knowledge had affected her father over the years. Poor Zeno had been consumed with the desire to see his wife again and had fallen into the trap of searching for the Hallows all this time. Such a mindset was to be avoided at all cost in the girl's mind, and so she didn't expose the artifact's origin. Hermione, being the bookworm she was, tried to find any and all information on Harry's bloodline, but was surprised to note that the trail ran cold at a certain point in the family tree. It was an unnatural stop too, like all the information about that particular topic had been purposefully removed. Nick was fairly certain that that was Dumbledore's doing, as probably the one person in the castle with a reason to hide that particular piece of history. Still, by the end of the month Nick had close to 400 soul-shot arrows. Thanks to his constant refining of the sun's light, he had improved the base technique so dramatically that the before and after techniques barely even resembled each other anymore. At this point Nick could draw enough light to form 3 arrows per collection he did. As a result, he had been generous and started to sacrifice some of the light material to the realm, causing it to form a tiny marble-sized sun at its edge. It wasn't much, but it brightened up the realm by quite a bit as the ambient light increased several folds. After what was basically half a month of almost constant refining, Nick was feeling a bit worn out on the process and took a break to take on some commissions from students and staff members. It was funny how after the events of last year all he needed to do was have the twins pass out the information on him taking limited commissions for Nick to get dozens of visitors in the same day. Chapter 308, Commissions. Literally everyone in the castle was aware that he could create fairly solid enchantments for all manner of things. The best example of this was the Playmaker rings that more than a few people were dying to get their hands on. To be fair though, Malfoy still goes around making an ass of himself by bragging about his own ring that was all shiny and pretty to look at. Nick had to screen the people coming for commissions, as more than a few were clearly trying to rip him off. Like a first-year Slytherin student actually thought that Nick was stupid enough not to realize why he wanted a solid gold ring with an enchantment to get away with sleeping in class for cheap. The student tried to argue that Nick shouldn't be charging for materials, at which point Nick kicked him out. Unless someone provided the material themselves, he was definitely going to charge for them, or else it comes out of his pocket. Despite the few troublemakers, he did get quite the eclectic and varied set of orders. From water breathing to flight, the list was extensive and made Nick's friends wonder why someone would even want some of them, like the person who wanted a ring that purred like a cat when stroked. That wasn't a joke, as a first-year Hufflepuff girl wanted exactly that for some reason. Nick split the commissions into 3 categories based on a few factors such as difficulty, material cost, research time, and how willing he was to do it. The categories basically just decided the order he did them in, with the easy and near effortless ones coming first, followed by the moderate difficulty and research involved ones, and finally the pains in the ass time sinks. After he had crafted his realm ring, Nick was surprised to find out that his soul had fully resonated with his body and mind, perfecting his channeling of spiritual energy. This meant that he no longer glowed when he enchanted something, though the glow from the rings and floating words during the process was still there. This was a huge boon to Nick, as it meant he could now crank out even more rings a day, since he wasn't wasting as much energy during each session. Meanwhile, his friends were each improving by leaps and bounds in each of their chosen fields with his help. Ron finally crafted his first wand that was functional, using a piece of unicorn hair that Nick let him have as his first core material. Ron bragged to literally everyone who would listen to him for a week after that. Nick, on the other hand, was still studying the staff in his realm, as he was constantly improving his veritology knowledge thanks to what he was getting. See, the staff was made in a far more advanced version of the subject that used hard-to-deduce methods. The core of the staff was from an extinct creature as well that was worth studying by itself. Hermione and Daphne were both quickly becoming fluent in Elder Futhark, as they rarely made any mistakes anymore when they wrote out sentences. Harry and Luna showed the greatest improvement, however, as when they dueled now, the only advantage Harry had over Luna was his much larger mana pool. Nick still won whenever he dueled against them, but he worked up a sweat so long as he didn't use any vicious moves to end the matches early. Tracy, on the other hand, was stuck in what may as well be crafting limbo, as Nick told her to create something from scratch without copying something else. All decent craftsmen need to learn how to think of designs and patterns for what they make, which was a lot harder than one would think. Tracy wasn't the most imaginative person, so struggled to come up with something from the top of her head. Still, other than that, she had already memorized the list of metals Nick had given her as well as their properties. While he worked on his list of commissions, Nick also published his study on the merfolk community living in the Black Lake. It didn't make too much of an impact on the wizarding community at large, but it was mentioned in a few small research newspapers and a tiny spot in the Daily Prophet. As promised, Dumbledore got a copy of it for himself, while the Hogwarts library also got a copy. Nick may seem carefree during this time, but he was watching for any sign of Voldemort making a move. He knew the man wouldn't be able to sit still for very long and was bound to do something to advance his agenda. Chapter 309, Laughable Attempt. Nick was correct too, as Voldemort was indeed planning a big move from his current place of residence, the Riddle Manor. His new servant was less than optimal in terms of power and influence, but one of those could be easily fixed with his guidance. In fact, that was what he had been doing this entire time, conducting various dark rituals to enhance the average talent of the servant to an acceptable level. Foul things that granted great power at terrible cost, that had reduced the servant to something not human, much like himself. Go now and bring me everyone related to the boy's past. I refuse to believe that he merely appeared out of nowhere. The cold voice of the Dark Lord spoke from a lounge chair. The cloaked servant bowed and left, while the Dark Lord stroked his pet Nagini with a stern expression. Voldemort had secretly investigated Nick in depth without doing anything to draw attention to himself, but was concerned to learn that no one seemed to have any clue at all where the boy came from. The earliest piece of information that could be found was the boy walking out of an alley covered in serious injuries with amnesia. Upon investigating the alley in question, all Voldemort discovered was that there was a almost completely faded trace of magic that sadly collapsed when he tried to capture it. Unknown to him, however, his failure and investigation were noticed by a certain group that had been watching all traces of Nick's background for a certain reason. Should we tell the Elder of this development? A man hidden in a shadow asked a small glowing orb seriously. To normal ears, a hissing sound came from the orb in response. In truth, it was a female voice speaking in Parseltongue. No, we shall continue to observe the boy's activities and past locations for now. Should that person continue poking where they have no right, we will inform the Elder before making our next move. The voice spoke from the orb before the orb stopped glowing. I wonder what fortuitous event it was that you met here that has changed you so much, little nephew. The man muttered before doing as he had been told and watching the traces Nick had left behind. Fate shifted in the background as many things unfolded in the shadows of the world with but a single focal point. Meanwhile, Nick woke up on the 1st of December slightly uncomfortable, as the cold had rapidly overtaken the school in the past week. Nazgul had grown larger over the past month and was now the size of a large dog breed such as a Tibetan Mastiff. As a result, she had gone from adorable to slightly intimidating as her muscles developed and grew alongside her. Unfortunately for Nick, this meant that he simply didn't have enough room on his current bed to accommodate her. Needless to say, she was not happy about it at all. Nick also couldn't take her with him into classes anymore, as she simply couldn't fit comfortably due to all the desks that were close together. Instead, she was allowed to wander the castle freely, which had developed in an odd manner as she was best friends with a young unicorn from the forest now. It came as quite the shock to Nick to say the least when he sought her out only to see her running around with the creature near Hagrid's hut. In an interesting development, today was actually the first day that the new teacher was introduced. Getting dressed, Nick left the dorm room casually and sighed in relief when he got into the common room as the roaring fireplace was spreading plenty of warmth. He let Nazgul out of the realm where she sleeps now and settled down on the chair nearest the fire as he pulled out the 4th year textbook of spells to study them. He had already fully read the book before but was making sure that he didn't miss anything important when he schemed through it. He found 1 or 2 small things that were missing from his understanding, but otherwise he found that he was well set. That merely took him about 30 minutes since he was scheming through the book again, and so moved on to the topic of one of his commissions, flight. Contrary to how it may seem, there were in fact several different ways to fly as a wizard besides on a broom. The problem came in the form of how obscure the magic involved was, to the point that Nick had only found 2 tomes on it in the entire library, ancient section and all. Chapter 310, Flight. Even worse was that one of those tomes was merely pure theory without any actual spells, while the other had a single half-finished piece of magic that was stupidly complex as it involved both a ritual and a spell, and both were incomplete. It was fairly easy to guess how irritating it was for Nick to have to slowly piece together both of those via a lot of trial and error. The plus side, however, was that he had figured out how Voldemort and his Death Eaters flew without brooms. That black smoky stuff they turn into is a byproduct of twisting this exact piece of magic in a dark direction. Nick himself had no plan to ever use this magic personally, since he was planning to undergo the Animagus transformation. He was almost 90% sure about what he would turn into thanks to the Patronum charm he had been practicing periodically. He finally summoned his corporeal patroness and was not surprised to find that it was none other than a celestial bird. It was huge, by the way, like 12 feet tall huge. Appearance-wise it looked most like a phoenix with an extra set of wings directly below the first and long tail feathers. Animagi tended to transform into their patroness animals, so Nick felt he was likely no different in this regard. The biggest problem once again came in the form of the phenomena that accompanied the birth of a magical beast. Him turning into an elf had not gotten that phenomena since he was not being born so much as elevated to a higher state. Unfortunately, arithmancy was proving horribly difficult to make progress in, and the phenomena he had experienced twice needed a high mastery of the field to call down. Shaking his head to clear away those thoughts, Nick went back to reading the theory tome on flight magic. While fairly complicated, the field of magic could be boiled down roughly into a group of 5 rules. The first was that the magic was almost always very draining on the mana reserves of the witch or wizard. The second rule was that the magic must always have a stabilization component, or the user will certainly go up but at an uneven rate. The third rule was similar to the second, as it was that the magic must always contain a control component so that the user could steer. The fourth rule was that the magic must always have a way to negate the effects of gravity, or else the cost goes up dramatically. The final rule was the magic of flying through space was different than that of the atmosphere. Some of these rules made Nick think that the person who wrote this tome had definitely had their own method to fly and had personally experienced these things. Wizards had tried to reach the moon several times according to the history books after all, and someone with flight magic had a good chance of succeeding if they were prepared enough. Nick didn't put away the tome even after Hermione walked down from the girls' dormitory, since he had no need to hide this topic from her. "Is there actually a spell that lets one fly without a broom?" she asked curiously after reading the title. Nick nodded. "From what I can tell based on this book and one other, there is likely several. The annoying part is that the library doesn't have any of them. Well, complete spells anyways," he said honestly. "Perhaps they are in the forbidden section," she suggested, but Nick shook his head. "I checked there already, there weren't," he said with a shrug. Hermione frowned at that answer. "I can't believe you broke into the forbidden section, it's forbidden for a reason, you know." She scolded him and he scoffed. "Most of those books contain dangerous or illegal knowledge and or are cursed, which is why they are forbidden for all but those who get permission. I have no interest in dark magic and those curses are child's play to get around, so I barely visit that section," he explained disdainfully. For being forbidden, that section was a huge disappointment to Nick, as all the information there was either on topics he didn't care about like the dark arts, or on highly advanced but usually illegal topics like potion recipes like polyjuice. Hermione looked both relieved that he wasn't interested in the stuff in the forbidden section and worried about his clear disregard for the rules. She knew he broke at least 4 every single day for a fact, as she has seen him do it, but they were usually the rules that seemed pointless, like the no spells in the hallways rule. Chapter 311, New Teacher. Despite these concerns, Hermione didn't voice them, since as far as she could tell Nick tended to know what he was doing even if it was dangerous. Instead, she moved the conversation back to the magic of flight, since the topic certainly interested her. She lacked any talent with a broom, which was a shortcoming she loathed but accepted as a fact. But if she learned how to fly without a broom, it simply wouldn't matter anymore. They chatted about the topic for a while as Nick showed her the progress he had made in finishing the incomplete magic. She gave him few insights that he hadn't thought of during the conversation that he didn't hesitate to add to the process. All in all, it was a fruitful conversation that lasted until Harry and Ron woke up and came down the stairs of the boys' dorm. "Why are you two always up so early? Do you just not like sleep or something?" Ron asked with a yawn. "That's not even right. I go to bed before all of you most of the time, so I'm not missing any sleep at all, thank you very much," Nick said defensively. They all chuckled at that but didn't argue, since he wasn't lying, as he tended to go straight to bed after dinner, whereas they stay up an extra hour or two. After that they all headed to the Great Hall for breakfast, while Nick kept complaining about the cold. He wasn't alone in his complaints either, as the Paddle twins also disapproved of the temperature. Nick wasted no time at all casting a warming spell on himself and his friends, while also generously using it on the twins as well. It took a minute for the hall to fill with hungry students, but once it was, Dumbledore stood up. "Good morning, everyone. If I could have your attention, I have several important announcements to make." His voice filled the hall, and all the students stared at the man curiously. "I am pleased to introduce your new defense against the dark arts professor, Remus Lupin," he said, and pointed his hand at a man with a claw-scarred face and pale skin that sat under light brown hair. Lupin stood up and bowed slightly at the applause that he got from the students, while Snape looked like he had been fed a whole sack of lemons before someone killed his favorite cat. "Yeah, I'm not going to get involved in that inevitable clash if I can help it," Nick thought seriously. In truth, he thought Snape would have been an excellent professor, since the man was very well practiced in the dark arts. But with Voldemort's return, Nick knew that Dumbledore likely thought it was best to leave him as potions, which gave him plenty of free time. It wasn't all good news for Lupin to take office so suddenly, however, as Nick had not researched lycanthropy at all and thus couldn't make a ring to counter it yet. This meant that the man would be a danger to everyone until Nick managed to fix that problem. "I am also pleased to say that starting after this coming Christmas break, Hogwarts will be offering extra electives involving the crafting arts for those who are interested." The Great Hall fell into uproar at this announcement, and many students shot hopeful glances at Nick, likely thinking he was going to be the teacher for one of those. Nick smirked at these people because he knew for a fact that Dumbledore wouldn't do that without informing him first. The final announcement is that as of now the Dueling Club is being reinstated under the dual teaching of Professors Lupin and Flitwick. Please apply with your heads of house if you are interested. For now though, eat and have a wondrous day," Dumbledore said while clapping his hands, which caused the tables to fill with food. "What a clever move by the old man," Nick said with an approving smile. "What ya talking about? That crafting thing?" Ron asked, confused. "No, rather the Dueling Club instead," Nick said with a shake of his head. "Remember how things have recently gotten much more dangerous after Harry warned us? Dumbledore probably wants to use this Dueling Club to help us students better protect ourselves when we leave Hogwarts," Nick explained, and all his friends at the table had wide eyes as they figured out what he meant. This Dueling Club was only announced after Voldemort had returned, which was likely not a coincidence at all. More likely than not, both Lupin's instatement and this Dueling Club were both done in a hurry to better prepare the students for the inevitable hardships ahead. Chapter 312, Source of Lycanthropy. Nick's suspicion was proven true when McGonagall herself came to him in the workshop as his friends were discussing the announcements. Today was a Saturday, so the entire faculty was free at the moment, which meant the old man had his pick of McGonagall. "Mr. Ravenclaw, the headmaster would like to speak to you in his office. If you would please follow me, we can see this matter handled with utmost haste." The stern witch spoke after the door of the workshop was open after she knocked. "Is he in trouble?" Harry asked with a concerned expression. "Not at all, Mr. Potter. If anything, this could be considered a boon for Mr. Ravenclaw, though I am not at liberty to discuss why," the elderly witch said calmly. Nick stood up from his chair and dusk landed on his shoulder, while Nazgul stood next to him, eyeing the older witch intelligently. McGonagall shifted in place in discomfort, which tipped Nick off that she had been let in on his familiar's soul-eating ability. "You know her, Professor. Just because of what she can do does not mean she is any different," he said, and the professor looked surprised for a moment before sighing. "You are correct, Mr. Ravenclaw. Thank you for reminding me, since I had forgotten," she said gratefully. Nick waved it off. "Think nothing of it. Now we'd best be on our way, as I have a suspicion as to the purpose of this meeting, but will reserve that thought until I get denial or confirmation on the matter," he said, and she nodded before leading him away. They didn't talk the entire trip to the headmaster's office. In fact, the only words the professor spoke was the password to the gargoyle cockroach clusters. The gargoyle moved aside and unlike normal McGonagall went into the office as well, where Nick in fact found almost all of his teachers. Snape, McGonagall, Flitwick, and even Sprout were all waiting inside with the headmaster and the newest Professor Lupin. Nick saw the lineup and grew serious. "So I was right, and this is about the danger bound to come soon," he said calmly. "I had assumed you might be able to predict the purpose to this meeting after the announcements at breakfast," Dumbledore said with a small smile. Nick looked at Lupin and examined him with his magical senses before raising an eyebrow. "So that's the source of lycanthropy. The person behind it made a few flawed assumptions during that attempt," he said, causing Lupin and the rest to all have shocked expressions. "What have you found?" Dumbledore asked curiously. "I won't sugarcoat it since none of you are daft or barmy. The source of lycanthropy is a flawed attempt by someone to complete the animagus ritual process but modified to make to end result a magical beast instead of a normal one. They made several crucial mistakes, however, that caused the curse to be born instead," Nick explained disdainfully. "How did you come to this conclusion exactly?" McGonagall asked, clearly finding his answer probable if not accurate. She herself was an animagi as well as master of transfiguration, so she knew that if a few changes were made to the ritual, contagion such as the way werewolves are created is very much doable. The first piece of evidence is the fact that an animagi can't be infected with lycanthropy, which should only be the case if two types of the same magic clash, with the more perfect magic coming out on top. The second piece of evidence is the fact that the lycanthropy transformation is tied to the full moon while the animagus ritual is tied to the new moon. Finally is because I myself happen to know exactly what the reason wizards and witches fail to become magical beasts during the ritual is and how the ritual should be modified to allow it," Nick said calmly, and everyone in the room looks at the resident expert on the subject for confirmation that she gives in the form of a solemn nod. "If it's nothing too secretive, could you explain what that reason is?" Dumbledore asked with a knowledge-eager expression. None of the professors other than Lupin doubted Nick's words, since he had shown repeatedly that he does not boast about things he wasn't sure of. "It's not that secretive, since anyone who has personally witnessed the birth of a magical creature was exposed to it, though unknowingly. See, I am rather sensitive to the changes in magic near me, as most of you should have noticed by now," Nick said, and they all nodded. "Thanks to that sensitivity, I discovered that at the precise moment of birth a magical phenomena takes place, like the world itself, marking the creature as magical and therefore different from normal beasts. Witches and wizards lack this phenomena and as such can only turn into non-magical creatures," he explained, leaving all of them enlightened as they finally understood the problem. Chapter 313, Solution to Lycanthropy. "If this is true, then why is there no records of such a phenomena?" Snape asked critically. Nick knew that the man was merely being thorough in his understanding of the information and as such was unbothered by the man's tone. For the same reason that no one here knows how to perform any of the grand works of magic that Merlin or the founders performed, time. As it flows ever forward, time sinks information below its currents to either be rediscovered later or lost forever. The fact is that most powerful wizards have a great deal of secrets involving their powers, and once they die those secrets are lost until rediscovered by another. As this process happens over and over again due to the selfishness of the powerful, wizards as a whole lose more and more knowledge as the powerful hide away things they find, preventing any in the future from knowing them. While this information may exist in some form locked away in a forgotten place, the rest of the world simply won't know about it until it's publicized," Nick explained honestly. No one argued with him either, as he was correct about those with power keeping their research and knowledge secret from others, as each person here with any achievement under their belt had done so themselves. "What about lycanthropy then? If it is as you said, then why hasn't it been corrected yet, since it should be easy?" Lupin asked, finding the solution to his curse was a easily fixable mistake hard to swallow. Nick smiled mockingly. The answer to that was sheer bad luck for the werewolves. Those who wanted to fix it lacked the ability or talent to learn how, while those who could fix it lacked the will to try. Basically, the entire werewolf problem was because no one actually cares about it at all until they themselves are afflicted. There may be a few rare exceptions, but otherwise that is the reality of it. To summarize, bad luck for the werewolves," Nick said with a chuckle at the awkward expressions everyone in the room had as Lupin looked around. "Take me for example, even now I don't care about the matter past the benefits it offers me. I may not be a cruel or apathetic individual, but I am also no saint that will waste his time on a matter that neither benefits nor concerns myself," Nick added, making everyone but Snape stare at him in shock. Nick was a pragmatist at heart, and it had always shown in every action he took, as they all benefited or concerned him or those around him. Everyone here except Lupin was aware of this, but had never expected Nick to lay it out so bluntly. Snape wasn't surprised though, as it seemed only natural in his eyes that a person like Nick wouldn't mince words for no good reason. It was a trait he admired greatly, as such frankness led to the greatest of loyalty in those who chose to follow others. While it hurts to see that here, I thank you for your honesty in this matter. What do you gain from helping me, if I may ask? Lupin said with a depressed sag in his demeanor. This is a many birds with one stone sort of a situation. Nick said with a grin. See, I happen to need quite a lot of data on animagi magics, so I may modify the ritual to my own needs in the future, which studying your condition will provide me. In addition to this, your long-term presence in the school as the Dada professor will improve the quality of the graduates by several levels. Then there is the immediate gain of your relationship with my best friend Harry, whom I believe you still haven't introduced yourself to, a poor decision but yours to make. Finally though, and you'll all love this one, you'll be a slap in Voldemort's face as one of his enemies takes the position he longed to occupy years back. As I said, many birds with one stone. Nick said with a smile, while most of the professors realized that he had really thought about the matter. How long do you need to remove this curse? Dumbledore asked seriously, since he was now certain that Nick was confident in this regard. Remove it? Impossible. Nick stated firmly, surprising everyone here and leaving Lupin horrified. Animagi magic is soul and body based, and Lupin has had the curse for far too long to remove it without ripping his soul itself to pieces. Rather than remove it, it would be more accurate to say that my method is replacing the faulty parts of the magic with the improved, better ones. I can't remove the curse, but I can certainly turn it into a blessing instead. Nick said with a wide smile. Chapter 314, Exemption. Everyone except Snape sighed in relief when they heard him say this. Had us worried there for a moment, Nick. Flitwick said honestly. Nick shrugged. To be totally honest, lycanthropy's creation is a fairly easy thing to deduce once you have all these details. The wizard or witch behind it likely had a wolf as their patroness, but was unhappy with simply turning into a normal wolf via the standard animagus ritual, and thus tried to modify the ritual to turn into a magical wolf. They actually got fairly close too, from what I can tell. See, they added a component to the magic that made the transformed state of the finished product have the standard magical beasts features such as magic resistance and powerful body. However, they did this through a form of life magic, I suppose you could call it. This is where the effectiveness of the curse came from, as it made the magic itself have properties of a living thing, which included propagation. They also used a botched form of soul manipulation magic to try and modify their form from pure wolf into a larger, more robust form without taking the necessary steps to ensure stability. Altogether, this curse is a half-baked idea at best. Nick criticized disdainfully. I would need to witness a transformation personally before I can even consider trying to mess with the curse, though, since at the moment it's dormant, but at the time of the full moon it will become active and may have more nuanced aspects I can't sense at the moment. Nick added honestly. Dumbledore nodded in understanding, a reasonable request considering the circumstances of the matter. As luck would have it, the next full moon is next week on Wednesday, he said calmly. Lupin looked horrified at the very idea of Nick being anywhere near him when he transformed. You need not worry yourself, Professor Lupin, as I doubt the old man would leave me without some form of protection. Nick pointed out to help calm the man. That is correct, as I myself or one of the other professors will be present to prevent any mishaps. Dumbledore said in agreement, which did help Lupin to relax a little. Before anything else is discussed, however, I believe it's time to talk about the true reason that you have been called here today, Mr. Ravenclaw. Dumbledore then spoke seriously. Exactly how far ahead of your peers in terms of studying? He asked sternly. Nick thought about it for a moment before replying, about the middle of the fourth year in most classes and postgraduate in the case of runes and transfiguration. I have currently been studying arithmancy but have trouble with it since I need to be very careful as the tomes on the subject lack many details. Nick answered without holding back at all. Everyone in the room sucked in a breath of air at his answer, as they knew he was advanced but not that advanced. As the people in charge of those subjects, they knew better than anyone how big of a qualitative difference the subject matter is from the second year in comparison to the fourth. The matter of transfiguration was an entirely different thing, since they had already been aware of that due to his regular use of the subject openly. Runes, on the other hand, was a surprise that came out of nowhere. Sure, they knew that Nick likely was a little aware of them thanks to his apprenticeship with Ollivander, but clearly he was far more than just familiar with the subject. I see. Then there is no problem with what we professors have decided to do in light of the return of Voldemort, as well as the value of your time. It was thoroughly discussed between all of us, and we have all agreed that your continued attendance of class with your peers for the moment is a waste of both your and their time. I am prepared to exempt you from all classes for the rest of the year and possibly the next, so long as you pass the exams for this year's classes early. While we are reluctant to admit it, your time and talents would be better spent self-studying and preparing for the troubles to come. Those rings of protection you make, for example, are quickly becoming necessary for many, and we all agree that you spending your time helping prepare us is better than sticking so strictly to tradition. Dumbledore spoke slowly but seriously, and Nick's jaw hit the floor. It needs to be understood that in 1,000 years of history since the school had been founded, not a single student had been exempted from class for more than a couple months, depending on the severity of the situation. Chapter 315, Exemption, 2. To say that Nick was surprised by this turn of events would be a huge understatement, as he was entirely speechless. He had at most expected that he would get 1 or 2 classes exempted or reduced to give him more time to improve himself, but full exemption had never even crossed his mind. Nick knew that the only reason the professors were even making this decision was that there was now 2 Dark Lords active at the same time and only 1 Dumbledore. The man himself was stretched thin trying to track down Grindelwald and his followers, so throwing another Dark Lord into the mix was simply far too much for him to handle. Add on that Nick's creations were capable of filling any need that may arise, and he was suddenly a very valuable resource to be utilized as much as possible to protect innocence. In peaceful times this would never happen, but the conditions were just right for an exception to be made on his behalf. While this is a fantastic opportunity, it also comes with a heavy responsibility. Though I suppose having to double or triple up on my protective rings is a small price to pay for such a thing, he thought seriously. If the exams are on the content of this year's classes, it should be a problem to pass them. That said, how exactly are we doing this, and what exactly do you all want out of it? Nick asked, so he knew exactly what he was getting himself into. Each of my colleagues have agreed to individually test you in their field of teaching over the next week. With the exception of myself, since there is little doubt of your transfigurative abilities. McGonagall said sternly. Nick nodded in agreement. That's fair enough, but that didn't answer my second question. What do you all want from me specifically, because I doubt it is only an increase in production for the rings of protection. He said seriously. You are correct, Mr. Ravenclaw. Snape spoke up at this point. In exchange for this exemption, you are required to not only provide many more of those rings, but also need to provide as many different types of offensive artifact as possible for the battle ahead. He spoke with a calm and cold tone that brokered no arguments. Nick ran through a list of different possible enchantments he could make for offensive means and frowned. That was a very long list, and while he doubted that he actually needed to provide all of those options to them, even a fraction of them would be enough to level a continent. Not all at once, mind you, since he wasn't that powerful, but if they were all used in separate locations simultaneously, the maps would definitely need to be redrawn. It should not be too much of a problem so long as the enchantments aren't very complex. That reminds me, for whatever reason, but I have something that should be able to kill Amortal evil creatures. He said, taking out a soul-shot arrow. Snape immediately clutched his right arm where the dark mark was located, as the mere presence of the arrow made it hurt. I wasn't aware that you made weapons as well. Dumbledore said, surprised at the item that he could feel's powerful purifying and anti-evil properties. Nick shrugged. I was always able to make weapons and even armor, I just prefer rings is all. He said honestly. Flitwick walked over to Nick and examined the arrow he was holding with furrowed eyebrows. Is something the matter, Phileas? McGonagall asked, concerned at the look on the half-goblin's face. This arrow is very strange, I don't recognize any of the materials at all, and the enchantment simply doesn't exist. It's like the arrow doesn't have magic but is magic. The small professor said seriously as he racked his brain trying to wrap his head around what he was seeing. Nick was surprised at how fast the secret of the arrow was discovered, but after considering that Flitwick was a master enchanter, it wasn't all that strange. Correct on all account, Professor, this arrow was made using a very special method I came up with. Nick said with a grin. You make us older generations look bad by creating brand new methods like this, you know. Flitwick said with a sigh. If it helps, this new method is quite a bit more limited in versatility than my original. Nick said with a smirk. How so? Dumbledore asked curiously. I have no reason to keep it a secret, since observing the creations closely would reveal their nature. I found a way to congeal the magical nature of the celestial bodies in the sky, such as the stars, sun, and moon. This arrow, for example, is the magic of the sun condensed into item form. He said proudly.